What's up guys, Samson Sound with EDMProd here. Today we've got 5 essential mixing tips for you guys. Let's get right into it. Tip number 1, guys, is to do stem mixdowns. And a stem mixdown is essentially what we have here, kick, sub, mid, bass, each element on its own channel, percussion, FX, etc. Nice clean little rainbow to work with, right? And this is what mixing engineers use for a reason. And when you start your mix, you want to act as if, right? You want to act as if you're a professional mixing engineer. What you don't want to do, I'm going to go over to an old project here, is work with something like this. This is just an absolute nightmare, right? To even just scroll up and down the project, it's probably going to take me 30 seconds just to even, still scrolling. I'm not even halfway through, channel 51. It's absolutely insane. You're just setting yourself up for a disaster trying to mix down something like this. Still scrolling. How am I still scrolling? 138 channels. You're going to be tempted to go in here on this little white noise piece. You're going to get it perfect. You're going to add some reverb to this channel. You're going to compress it. And you're just working on such a small piece of the overall painting, right? If we were to think of our song as like, some binary code, you're just working on like this tiny little piece here, a single digit of it. So this is definitely the way to work. And so let's just get a quick little, rough mix of this track going here. This is a track called Hello Humans that I haven't released yet. Let's just bring all our faders down to negative infinity and then pull them up one by one to taste. Also wanted to mention, guys, as part of this tutorial, we're giving away our free mixing racks for Ableton. So make sure you guys cop those below. And let's just bring up the kick, then sub, etc. Now our sub, mid bass, leads, percussion, all right, so we're already halfway there, right? We can keep refining it, but we've got a somewhat balanced mix to work with. And that took what? All of 1 minute, right? If we were working on that other project, it takes a minute just to scroll up and down the project. Now, a couple other reasons that I am a huge fan of stem mixdowns these days, and this is speaking for myself, I have an absolute beast of a gaming laptop. When I go back to Ableton 10 or 11 to open up an old project like the one I showed you, it doesn't even run. It just completely lags out. I'm pushing, on the top right here, pushing 130% on the buffer. It's just basically garbage. And in order to use it, I have to delete all the channels and bounce one to audio. It's just a nightmare. So if you have a project, a song that you like and think has potential, absolutely bounce it out. You're going to be thanking yourself later, right? Because these are basically gold for your producer's kitchen that you can drag in later. Once you have them in your sample library, you can just drag it in, resample it, use the sub bass again in a similar track. And also, a lot of the magic happens in this part of the process too. Certain genres like bass music, experimental, glitchy stuff, like guys like G Jones, they're doing a lot of the magic happens in this stage, right? Where they have their vocal channel, they're just pasting stuff over, doing little stutters and edits because it's so much easier to work with just one channel instead of 138, right? Now, other than that, I think that it's just nice because if you have stems and you've been listening to your track a million times and you just can't finish the mix, you're already set up to just ship it off to a mixing engineer and then you can get it back and release the track. Tip number 2, guys, is to let the 3 main mixing dimensions guide you. And those are basically the 3 main pillars of a mix when you're analyzing it. You've got tonal balance, basically your mix of lows, mids, and highs, your width, how wide stuff is in certain spots, and your overall loudness. So what we can do now is take our rough mix we did before and start dialing it in further by comparing it to a reference track. And so I've got Bad at Titles here by deadmau5 and Atlas. If you saw my last tutorial called How to Mix Kick and Bass like deadmau5, we go into a bit more detail on using a reference like this and dialing in the low end. But essentially, we've got Bad at Titles that sounded like this. And then we've got our track, Hello Humans. So what I like to do first is just lock in the low end, right? Kick, sub. So I'm going to solo multiband dynamics in the lows here. And we're just going to A-B back and forth. First dead mouse and then our track. So ours can definitely come up a little bit. I'm just going to boost these a little bit. Now we'll listen again. First dead mouse track. Now ours. Okay, we're getting there. We're not quite there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a limiter on our master channel, right? Give us a little bit of gain because we are mixing down now. And also don't want to blow out our ears as we're making changes. We'll add a little bit of gain, maybe move these back a little bit. Now let's see how we're doing in our lows. Okay, now it's a little bit closer. I might even pull this back a little bit. Let's also look at the lows now. So I'm going to go open span here, and we're going to see where dead mouse is peaking over here in the sub region. So we're pretty close, right? The idea of a reference is have it just be a general ballpark, right? It's not something that it's like a holy grail that you're matching. So our lows are pretty close. Maybe we'll go 4 dB of gain. And now we can focus on the mids. So dialing in our tonal balance now, we're focusing on the mid-range. Bad at titles. So our mids are a little bit louder. I might pull back on the leads and mid bass just a little bit. And also our kick was sounding pretty heavy in the mid, so I might add a little bit of scoop there, a little bit of a dip here or something. Now let's A-B. All right, it's a little bit closer. Our leads are definitely a little bit louder in the mid-range, but you know, that is the face of this track, so I think I'm good with it. Now we'll go to the highs. Our percussion is a little bit louder. Bring it down just a touch. Listening to the whole track now. So our tonal balance is more or less dialed in. I think maybe the low end of our kick is getting a little bit lost in the sauce. We could add a little bit of side shading to help it cut through. But for now, let's go over to width. And one thing I like to do for width is open up a good old span and change the routing mode from default stereo to mid-side stereo. And then we can look at either just the mids or the sides. You could also use a tool like MSED, and that's going to allow you to just listen to either the sides by muting the mids or vice versa. You could also set up a utility in this fashion. I have this sideband solo preset here. If you want, you can just copy the settings here, and this is going to allow you to listen to just the sides. So let's look and listen to just the sides of Bad at Titles first. Now us. So clearly we're lacking a little bit of information in the mids and highs and the sides. So we could start to add some widening if we want. It's also nice to think about, again, the reference is just a tool. It's not a holy grail. So, you know, my leads, I kind of like that they're these fairly dry, like digital spacey beep type leads. So I don't really want to add much width. Maybe I could add something like Ozone Imager to the mid bass and experiment with increased width. This tool is nice because you can choose a band. For example, we could solo band 2 here and the kind of the low mids and experiment with increased width. You can see the effect over here. You could also press stereoize if you want to experiment with some Haas effect. I'm not going to add anything for now. Our mix is already okay to kind of move on. I'm going to go over to loudness, and we're going to open up good old Julian loudness meter. So this is our third mix dimension. We had first total balance, then width, and now we're looking at loudness. So Bad at Titles, around -8 lufs. And we're just a touch louder. We might be hitting the limiter a bit hot. We could maybe pull back on our sub just a touch. And for now, let's just move on to one last measure of loudness, RMS, BX meter here. Around -5. Now us. Again, just a touch louder. For loudness, you want to keep in mind that there's two main measures of loudness. You have peak, where stuff is peaking, and you have average perceived volume. So it takes a certain window of time for humans to perceive a sound, around 300 milliseconds or so. And so that's the point of RMS. If we go over to the good old session view, you can also see this visually. If you look at the mid bass, for example, these little green bars, see how there's two green bars? The dark green is the peak, and the light green is RMS. Tip number 3, guys, is to do a vertical and horizontal audit. And this is basically going to be a chance for you to squeeze sort of the last 5-10% of juice out of the orange, so to speak. And so vertical audit being we go element by element, starting with our kick, and we just have the goal of making some type of minor improvement, or at least A-Bing it with another option. You know, maybe we try it with an EQ curve like this and see which one we like better, or just decide that you like it as is and move on to the next element. So starting with our kick, a vertical audit might look something like this. We'll just solo our kick. And one thing I like to do on drums is add a little bit of hard clipping. So something like standard clip or G clip is a free version. You can add a little bit of hard clipping here. I'm going to pull this down. You hear now it's starting to distort, so I'm going to back off a little bit. And so if we see what's happening on our meters here, I'm going to turn our master limiter off for a second so we can see this. With good old standard clip off, we're peaking up here around +1, and with it on, we're around 3 here. So it has changed the character a little bit, turning our master limiter back on and just A-Bing one more time, with it off, with it on. It's not a huge difference, but if we were to add this to something like our percussion, we could probably save quite a bit of headroom. So let's just pull it down a lot until it distorts. Let's try that. Off, on. Can't really hear a difference, but again, if we go back over to our meter, off, on. Pretty big difference there, right? Now, you have to be careful with this because with standard clip on, you'll see that it's introduced some low frequencies, and we definitely don't want any sub-information in our top perks. So let's cut that out. There we go. So now we're peaking around 13 or 14. Before we were up here around 10. So a minor improvement. And this is the idea of a vertical audit. Just go element by element, you know, keeping in mind what we learned before about the side information. Maybe we'll experiment with a little bit of reverb. Let's add some hybrid reverb to our perk channel and see how we're sounding with that. I'm going to make a parallel chain here. So just press Control G to group it, Control D to duplicate it. And this is going to be our dry channel, so no reverb, essentially what we already have. And this is going to be our 100% verb channel. And then we can just start playing around with different presets and see if any of these verbs sound good. We'll bring the decay down, change the modes. Shimmer's kind of cool. Prism. So maybe we like this better, right? Let's listen. Let's go to a different part of the track. We've been listening to this part for a while. Let's go over here. Well, perks are over here, so I'm going to loop this. So we could maybe have just a little bit of reverb. It's still ringing out a little bit, so maybe we could have this turn on later in the song, so there would be some sort of progression for our percussion. Maybe it sounds like this in the first drop, and then maybe we automate this on in the second drop. You get the idea. And so this is the purpose of a vertical audit, just sort of go element by element. Maybe for the mid bass, we have some minor EQ boosts or scoops. You know, maybe something like this we decide is our improvement and then we move on. Maybe we listen to our sub. Sounds fine, so we can just move on. You get the idea. And a horizontal audit, as you may have guessed, is just the going across this way, right? So we could go in on our sub here. We could look at this here, clean up some tails. We don't want any sub playing when the kick is hitting here. So we could fix these tails here and just making sure that horizontally all the stems are what we want them to be. Tip number 4, guys, is to utilize the list method. And so just kind of stepping back from the Ableton technical stuff for a second, I've got some notes down here. The idea of the list method is once you have a mix that sounds somewhat reasonable, just bounce it out and go listen on an entirely new system. So for me, I like to bounce it out, go listen in the car. I listen in the car all the time. I know what sounds good in there. And just jot down, the 3 or 4 main things that are really popping out at you. And then go back into your headphones, into your monitors, and make some changes. It's very easy to get lost in the sauce. The stuff we were just doing with the vertical audit, that's all great. But it really is the minor details that can make you go crazy during a mix. And so it's nice to just step back and figure out, okay, what are the 3 or 4 major things I need to change so that this mix sounds reasonable across systems, right? And it is definitely nice to kind of figure out what your method is, right? So for me, I like to listen in headphones, monitors, my big QSC speaker. If you have access to that or a PA system, by all means, you want to listen back. And then go listen on my iPhone, go listen in the car, and just write down, again, like the 3 main things that I need to change in the mix. And then eventually you'll go back and listen and there'll be nothing on the list. And that's pretty much when the track is done, right? And so you can listen to your references as well. Maybe you have like a file that you make in Ableton. I've done this before where you have your track and then right after it, the reference plays, and then right after it, another reference plays, or even having like the kick, like a 2-second snippet of your drop play right next to a 2-second snippet of another track and then another reference, just so you can hear how they sound together right after each other in the car or on your iPhone. That can be a good way to work. But yes, the list method is my favorite way to work from a high level. Again, all the technical stuff, it's very easy to just drive yourself insane and think you need to, twisting all these knobs and being a professional mix engineer. It's like, at the end of the day, you just want it sounding decent across systems, and then we just want to finish our music and release it. Tip number 5, guys, is to view mixdowns as more of an art than a science. And I'm sure you've heard this before, but I think it's super important because if you view mixing as just this technical thing where you have to do X, Y, and Z and meet a certain standard, it just becomes super boring. Much better to have, your creative vision for the track and then let that inform your mixing decisions, right? So I thought we'd end with a fun little thing and just go through some of these songs and kind of talk about what they're doing as artists. So here I have first one of my old tracks called Black Hole, where I wanted to create sort of this bass stack that makes it seem like you're falling into a black hole, and then have sort of this minimal response after that where you're kind of floating around in the darkness.
You will now enter a black hole.
So when I went down to mix down the track, I was obviously very focused on processing, that bass stack. That was kind of the main idea of that drop. And I also wanted to make sure that there was a lot of space in the response section, right? So I had to pull back on some stuff and make sure that there was enough space to let it breathe. Next up, we have High On by Vinny Vici. And Vinny Vici likes to have these very hard-hitting, clean psytrance type drops that are mostly in mono. So let's give a listen. So if we look on the meter at just the sides like we were doing before and listen to just the sides, in the build-up, we're going to hear a ton of information. This is all the sides. And then in the drop, there's just the click on the kick. It's almost entirely mono. And so he creates contrast in this way, sort of adds more side information over time. Build up, and then back to mono in the drops. Next up, we've got Dream Sequence by Sudden Death. If you know Sudden Death, he makes pretty much the loudest possible, most aggressive dubstep and rhythm. I think this track peaks around 0 lufs. And one thing he does is he pushes his sides a ton in the drops. Let's do the same thing. We'll listen to the track, but we'll look at just the sides and see how much he's driving them. right? So super aggressive, lots of like screechy sounds where he's probably spending a lot of time making sure that the resonances are sort of biting at your ear in just the right amount. And so as you saw there, he had side information even down in the sub-region. So another example of breaking the rules. Next up, we have Prophecy by Virus. And this is an interesting track because it just starts out with a super, super loud hi-hat. Right? That closed hat is so much louder than anything. And he basically just owns this and has it go still playing there in the final drop. And still super loud. So, right? If you were subscribing to some rule about hats need to be at -8 or -10, then, you would have never thought of making Prophecy. Now we've got Century of the Mouse by Surez D. And one thing that Eric Prydz likes to do is tease his ideas right at the start of his track. So if you listen in the background, you hear kind of like this ARP perky thing. It's very quiet, but later in the track, it just opens up. He basically opens up the filters. So that synth right there, bop, 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 bop. That's the same sound as in the start of the track, but he's just has it be, it's basically a tiny little perk at the start of his track where he's teasing his main idea. So knowing that maybe this is something you do as an artist, during the mixdown stage, you're probably going to spend a lot of time dialing in the way that that progresses over the course of your track. Now, last up, we have one of my favorite artists, John Hopkins. And this is a good example because John Hopkins, he never really does like a producer's flex or anything, just has very effective tracks. Right here, this song, Inner Peace, is just a super, super simple but effective kind of like melodic chill out track. And so you'll hear these little touches that I'm sure, he's dialing in during the mixdown phase. On the kick, for example, there's a few variations of it and it creates this nice little loop. If you hear either he's got a perk layered on the kick at certain hits and then it's a little different at other points. So here on the one, it's just a little bit louder or a little bit differently layered. And so John Hopkins here, a lot of his songs, he's not flexing at all. I think this is at like -15 LUFS, and he just focuses on the vibe and textures. And really, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. All right, guys, that pretty much wraps it up. If you have not yet grabbed those free Ableton mixing racks I mentioned earlier in the tutorial, definitely cop those. Other than that, I hope to see you guys at the next one. Peace.